The knock on the door came at midnight, and Margot Sedgwick knew before she opened it that her family's world had ended. Her father stood in the hallway holding a letter with hands that would not stop shaking. Behind him, two men in dark coats waited by the front gate, their carriage lanterns throwing long shadows across the gravel. Margot had never seen her father look so small. "Papa," she said, "what is it?" Charles Sedgwick could not meet her eyes. "I have ruined us," he whispered. "Every card game, every wager, every foolish promise I made at the tables, it has all come due tonight." Margot's younger sister, Alice, appeared on the stairs in her nightgown, clutching the banister. Their mother had died 3 winters ago, and since then it had been the 3 of them against whatever fortune threw their way. Fortune, it seemed, had finally thrown something they could not survive. "How much do we owe?" Margot asked, though she already dreaded the answer. "More than this house is worth. More than everything I own." Her father's voice cracked. "The debt was bought by a man 3 months ago. I did not know who held it until tonight, when his solicitor arrived with the final notice." "Who is he?" Her father lifted his eyes, and in them, Margot saw something worse than shame. She saw fear. "The Duke of Rothmere." The name struck the room like a dropped glass. Even Alice gasped from the stairs. Everyone in the county knew the name Rothmere, though almost no one had seen the man behind it in over a year. He had inherited the title young, after a scandal that was never fully explained, and since then he had lived like a ghost in his own estate, refusing invitations, refusing visitors, refusing, it was whispered, to feel anything at all. "He will take the house," Margot said quietly. "He will take everything." "No." Her father's voice dropped so low she had to lean in to hear it. "He offered a different arrangement. His solicitor said the Duke does not want land he cannot use, or coin he does not need. He wants a wife." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour. "A wife," Margot repeated. "You, Margot. He has asked for you, by name. In exchange, the debt is forgiven entirely. This house remains ours. Alice keeps her future, all of it, gone, as though it never existed." Her father's eyes were wet now. "I told the solicitor I would not sell my daughter like cattle. He said the Duke does not care what I call it. He gave me until sunrise to answer." Margot sat down slowly on the bottom stair, her legs no longer certain they could hold her. She thought of Alice, only 16, who deserved a chance at a life untouched by scandal and debt. She thought of her father, who would not survive prison or disgrace. She thought of herself, 22 years old, unmarried, with no suitors lining up despite her family's once respectable name, because respectability had bled out of them years ago along with the money. "I will do it," she said. "Margot, you do not have to." "I will do it, Papa. Send word before sunrise." She did not sleep that night. She sat by her window and watched the sky change from black to gray to a pale, indifferent blue, and she wondered what kind of man bought a wife the way other men bought horses or hounds. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The Duke of Rothmere, cold as the northern wind, a man who had buried whatever heart he once had. Some said a woman had broken him years ago. Others said he was simply born without the capacity for warmth. Margot did not know which story was true, and by morning, it no longer mattered. She would find out soon enough, whether she wished to or not. The wedding took place 11 days later, in a small stone chapel near the Rothmere estate, with barely a dozen witnesses in attendance. There were no flowers. There was no music beyond a single somber hymn. Margot wore a gown borrowed from a cousin, hastily altered, and she stood at the altar feeling like a stranger in her own life. The Duke arrived precisely on time, not a minute early, not a minute late, as though even his punctuality was a kind of control he refused to relinquish. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 30, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair cut close and eyes the color of slate before a storm. He was, she noted with an odd detachment, a handsome man. It made the coldness in his expression all the more unsettling, like frost forming over something that should have been warm. He did not smile at her. He did not offer a single word of comfort. When the vicar asked if he would take Margot Sedgwick as his lawful wife, he answered with a flat, unhesitating, "I will," the same tone a man might use to confirm a shipment of goods had arrived on schedule. Margot's own voice trembled when her turn came, but she said the words. What choice did she have? Afterward, there was no wedding breakfast, no celebration. The Duke's carriage waited outside the chapel, its dark lacquer gleaming under the overcast sky. He offered her his arm with mechanical politeness, helped her into the carriage, and settled across from her without a word. The door closed. The horses began to move. Margot watched her father and sister grow smaller through the window. waving with expressions caught somewhere between relief and grief, and she felt something inside her chest crack quietly in two. "You do not have to pretend to be pleased," the Duke said suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for nearly a mile. Margot turned to look at him. His gaze was fixed out the opposite window, his profile carved and unreadable. "I was not aware I was pretending anything, Your Grace." "Good," he said. "Then we understand each other." "And what is it we understand?" He turned to face her then, and for the first time she saw something flicker behind those slate-gray eyes, something that might have been weariness, or might have been warning. "This marriage exists to settle a debt, nothing more. I will provide for you, for your family, and for the running of my household. In return, I ask only that you do not expect from me what I am not able to give." "And what is that, Your Grace?" "Affection," he said simply. "Sentiment. The things women are taught to want from marriage. I have none of those things left to offer. I gave them away a long time ago, and they did not survive the giving." Margot studied him for a long moment, searching for cruelty in his words, and finding, instead, something closer to exhaustion. This was not a man boasting of his coldness. This was a man warning her, honestly, of a wound she could not see. "I did not marry you for affection, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I married you to save my family. I expect nothing more than what you have promised. A home, safety, nothing more." Something in his expression shifted, so briefly she almost missed it. Surprise, perhaps. He had expected tears, or anger, or the desperate performance of a woman trying to charm her way into his good graces. He had not expected simple, unadorned honesty. "Then we will manage well enough," he said, and turned back to the window, and did not speak again for the rest of the journey. The estate itself was a marvel, and a tomb in equal measure. Rothmere Hall rose from the countryside like something carved from the hills themselves, gray stone walls and dozens of dark windows, an ancient chapel on one side and formal gardens on the other, though the gardens, Margot noted as the carriage rolled up the long drive, looked untended, wild grass creeping over what had once been careful borders. Inside, the hall was grand and silent. Servants lined the entrance to greet their new mistress, but their faces held a caution Margot did not understand yet, a careful blankness that seemed practiced rather than natural. An older woman stepped forward, introduced as Mrs. Pemble, the housekeeper, her expression kind but guarded, as though she had learned long ago not to hope too openly for anything in this house. "Welcome to Rothmere Hall, Your Grace," Mrs. Pemble said, her curtsy brief and correct. "I will show you to your rooms." The Duke had already turned away, walking toward a corridor that branched off from the main hall, without another word to his new wife. Margot watched him go, his footsteps echoing against stone, and felt the full weight of what she had agreed to settle over her like a shroud. "This way, Your Grace," Mrs. Pemble said gently, and Margot followed her up a wide staircase, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors, past a long gallery where the afternoon light fell in dusty slants across the floor, until they reached a set of rooms in the east wing, far from where the Duke had disappeared. The chambers were beautiful, in the way that a museum is beautiful, carefully arranged, spotlessly clean, and entirely without warmth. There were fresh flowers on the writing desk. Someone had thought to arrange that small kindness, but the rest of the room felt untouched by any human presence in years. "Has anyone lived in these rooms before me?" Margot asked. Mrs. Pemble's expression flickered, just for a moment. "No one in a long while, Your Grace. Please ring if you need anything. Dinner is served at 7, though His Grace often takes his meal alone in the study. I will have a tray sent up if you would prefer to dine privately your first evening." "No," Margot said, surprising herself with her own firmness. "I will dine in the hall. If I am to be mistress of this house, I would like to begin as I mean to continue." Something in Mrs. Pemble's face softened, just slightly, an expression that might have been approval. "As you wish, Your Grace." That evening, Margot sat alone at the long dining table, a single place setting at one end, while an empty chair waited at the other. The Duke's chair, unoccupied. She ate in silence, watched by the eyes of painted ancestors on the walls, and told herself she had expected nothing less. It was near the end of the meal that she noticed the space above the mantel across the room, a rectangle of wall slightly less faded than the stone around it, the unmistakable shape of a portrait that had once hung there and had since been removed. She thought of asking Mrs. Pemble about it, but something in the housekeeper's earlier caution told her the question would not be welcomed. Later, walking the halls before retiring, unable to sleep in a house so unfamiliar, Margot passed the Duke's study. The door stood slightly ajar, and lamplight spilled through the gap onto the corridor floor. She should have walked on. Instead, she paused, and through the narrow opening she saw him. He sat at his desk, not working, not reading, simply staring at something in his hands, a small object, catching the lamplight, though she could not make out what it was from this distance. His shoulders, usually so rigidly held, had curved forward slightly, and his face, when she caught a glimpse of it in profile, wore an expression entirely unlike the cold composure he had shown her all day. It was grief. Unmistakable, raw grief, quickly hidden the moment he sensed her presence and looked up. Their eyes met through the gap in the door. Margot did not know what to say, so she said nothing, only inclined her head in a small, respectful nod, and continued down the corridor toward her rooms, her heart beating faster than the moment seemed to warrant. Behind her, she heard the study door close, firmly, decisively, shutting away whatever she had glimpsed as though it had never happened at all. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling of her new chambers, turning over everything she had learned in a single day. A husband who spoke of affection as something already spent and gone, a house stripped of warmth, portraits removed, gardens left to wildness, a man who could look, for one unguarded moment, like his heart had been broken so badly it had never learned to mend. Margot had come to Rothmere Hall believing she was marrying a debt, a transaction, a cold and distant duke who wanted nothing from her but silence and obedience. But lying there in the dark, she began to understand that the coldness was not the whole truth. It was armor, and armor, she knew, was only ever built around something a person was desperate to protect. She did not know yet what that something was, but she found herself, against every warning she had given her own heart, wanting to find out. Outside her window, the wind moved through the untended gardens, bending grass that no one had thought to cut in a very long time, and somewhere in the great stone house, behind a closed study door, the Duke of Rothmere sat alone, with whatever ghosts he kept, unaware that his new wife had already begun to see past the frost he had spent years perfecting. The first day of her marriage was over. Whatever came next, Margot understood, would not be the quiet, distant arrangement either of them had expected. Morning at Rothmere Hall began before the sun fully cleared the eastern hills, and Margot woke to the sound of servants moving through the corridors with the practiced quiet of people who had long ago learned not to disturb their master. She dressed without waiting for a maid, unused still to the idea that there were people whose entire purpose was to attend to her, and made her way down to the breakfast room, curious whether the Duke would be present. He was not. A single plate had already been cleared from the far end of the table, evidence that he had eaten and departed before she had even risen. Margot ate alone again, watching the empty chair, and told herself she was not disappointed. She had not expected companionship. She had expected exactly this. After breakfast, she resolved to explore the house that was now, by law and by ceremony, her home. Mrs. Pemble offered to accompany her, but Margot declined gently, wanting instead to walk the halls on her own terms, to learn the shape of her new life without an audience. The house told its story in fragments, if one knew how to look. She found a nursery on the third floor, untouched, dust sheets over a small bed and a rocking horse, as though prepared for a child who had never come. She found a music room with a pianoforte, its lid closed, a thin layer of dust across the wood, though the bench beside it had been recently wiped clean, as though someone still visited the room without ever playing. She found, in a locked drawing room she gained entrance to only because a maid had left the door unlatched, a scattering of covered furniture and, propped against the far wall, several framed portraits stacked with their faces turned away from the room, as though someone could not bear to look at them, and could not bear to destroy them either. She did not touch the portraits. Something told her this was not yet her right. It was in the garden, that afternoon, that she first encountered someone willing to speak plainly about the man she had married. An elderly gardener knelt among the overgrown beds, pulling weeds with slow, careful hands, and when Margot approached, he rose and bowed with more warmth than any servant had yet shown her. "You'll be the new Duchess, then," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Forgive me for staring. It has been some time since anyone new walked these gardens." "They must have been beautiful once," Margot said, looking at the tangled beds, the roses climbing wild and untrimmed over a stone archway. "They were, Your Grace." Her Grace's mother, the old Duchess, kept them herself, before she passed, and after that, the young master kept them tended for a good while, in her memory. Then, a few years back, he stopped coming out here altogether, told me not to bother with the flower beds anymore. Just the hedges, so the place doesn't look entirely abandoned. Why did he stop? The gardener's expression grew careful, the same caution she had seen in Mrs. Pemble's face. "That is not my story to tell, Your Grace. But I will say this, Whatever coldness you find in this house, it was not always here. I remember a time when this hall was full of noise, full of life. The young master used to laugh so loud you could hear it from the stables. He shook his head slowly. A man does not lose that on his own. Something is taken from him. Margot thought of the portraits turned to face the wall, the study door closing on a moment of unguarded grief, the empty space above the mantel where a painting had once hung. "Thank you," she said softly, and left the gardener to his weeds, though his words followed her back into the house like a question she could not stop turning over. She did not see the Duke again until dinner, 3 days into her marriage, when he appeared unexpectedly in the dining hall as she was finishing her meal. He took his seat at the far end of the table without acknowledgement, and a servant hurried to set his place. For several minutes, neither of them spoke, the only sound the quiet scrape of cutlery against porcelain. "You have been exploring the house," he said finally, not looking up from his plate. Margot's pulse quickened, uncertain whether this was an accusation. "I have, Your Grace." "I hope that was not forbidden." "It is your home now. You may go where you like." A pause. "Within reason." "There is a drawing room on the second floor kept locked. Is that among the places I should avoid?" His hand stilled over his glass. When he looked up at her, his expression had gone carefully blank, the way she imagined a man's face might go blank right before he shut a door on something painful. "That room is not to be disturbed." "I did not enter it," she said honestly. "A maid had left the door unlatched. I saw only enough to know it is full of covered furniture and portraits turned to face the wall." "Then you saw more than you were meant to." "I am sorry," Margot said, and meant it, though she was not entirely certain what she was apologizing for. "I did not mean to intrude on something private." The Duke set down his glass with deliberate care, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring at some point on the table between them. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual flatness, replaced by something quieter, more strained. "My mother kept that room as her private sitting room. After she died, I could not bring myself to change it, and I could not bear to use it either. So it sits, as it has sat for years, gathering dust, because I lack the courage to either restore it or let it go." He looked up at her then, and something in his eyes was almost a challenge. "Does that satisfy your curiosity, Duchess?" "I did not mean to cause you pain, Your Grace." "You did not," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "The pain was already there. You simply noticed it." He rose from the table before dessert was served, offering a brief, formal bow, and left the room without another word. Margot sat alone amid the flickering candlelight, turning his words over in her mind, and felt, for the first time since her wedding day, something other than fear or resignation. She felt curiosity, sharp and insistent, about the man she had married, and beneath that curiosity, something more dangerous still, the beginning of sympathy. The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. The Duke rose early and retired late, spending most of his hours either in his study or riding the far edges of his land, returning only for dinner, which he now attended more often than not, though their conversations remained brief and careful, both of them navigating around subjects too tender to touch directly. It was nearly 2 weeks into her marriage when Margot first witnessed a crack in the frost he wore so carefully. She had gone down to the kitchens one morning, restless with nothing to occupy her hands, and found the household in quiet chaos. A young maid, barely older than Alice, stood trembling near the pantry while the steward, a stern man named Mr. Doran, berated her loudly for a broken set of porcelain, threatening dismissal without wages or reference. "It was an accident," the girl protested through tears. "The step was wet. I did not see it." "Excuses will not replace what you have broken," Mr. Doran snapped. "You will be gone by morning." Margot stepped forward before she had fully decided to intervene. "Mr. Doran, a word, if you please." The steward turned, startled to find his new mistress standing in the kitchen doorway. "Your Grace, I did not realize." "I understand a set of porcelain has been broken," Margot said, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Accidents happen in every household, Mr. Doran, even the finest ones. I trust you do not intend to dismiss a girl for slipping on a wet step through no fault of her own." "Your Grace, the porcelain belonged to the old Duchess. His Grace values it greatly." "Then His Grace will understand that a broken plate matters far less than the fair treatment of the people in his service." Margot held the steward's gaze steadily, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "The girl will keep her position. If there are further concerns, you may bring them to me directly." Mr. Doran's jaw tightened, but he bowed stiffly. "As you wish, Your Grace." The maid, whose name Margot later learned was Nell, looked at her with an expression of such startled gratitude that it nearly brought tears to Margot's own eyes. No one in this house, it seemed, had expected kindness to arrive from above. She thought little more of the incident until that evening, when the Duke requested she join him in his study after dinner, a summons that filled her with a nervous uncertainty she could not quite name. He stood by the window when she entered, his back to her, hands clasped behind him in a posture she was beginning to recognize as his habit when something troubled him. "I understand you intervened in a household matter today," he said without turning. "I did, Your Grace. I hope I did not overstep. Mr. Doran believes you undermined his authority." Margot lifted her chin. Mr. Doran was prepared to dismiss a frightened young girl over a broken plate. "If that is authority, Your Grace, I confess I have little respect for it." The Duke turned then, and to her surprise, there was no anger in his expression, only something quieter, more considering, as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time. "The porcelain belonged to my mother. It was among the last things of hers that remained in daily use." "I did not know that," Margot said softly. "I am sorry for the loss, but I do not believe your mother would have wished a child dismissed and left without means over an accident with wet stone floors." Something shifted in his face, a flicker of memory perhaps, or recognition. "No," he said quietly, "she would not have. My mother believed the measure of a household was not in its china, but in how it treated the smallest hands within it." He studied Margot for a long moment. "You reminded me of her today, Duchess. I did not expect that." "Is that a fault, Your Grace?" "No," his voice had gone unexpectedly gentle. "It is not a fault at all." He said nothing further, only nodded once, a dismissal that felt somehow warmer than any words might have been, and Margot left the study with her heart beating strangely, unsteadily, in a rhythm she did not fully understand. It was 2 nights later that fever took hold of him. She learned of it from Mrs. Pemble, who came to her chambers past midnight, with a candle trembling in her hand, and worry etched across her face. "Your Grace, forgive the hour, but his Grace is taken ill. He refuses to send for the physician, and I fear the fever is worsening." Margot did not hesitate. She followed the housekeeper through darkened corridors to the Duke's chambers, where she found him tossing restlessly in bed, his brow slick with sweat, his usually composed features twisted with the confused mutterings of fever dreams. "Fetch cool water and cloths," Margot said, taking command of the room with an instinct she did not know she possessed, "and send for the physician regardless of what he says. A man in this state cannot refuse care he does not have the wits to consent to." Through the long hours of the night, Margot sat at his bedside, pressing cool cloths to his burning forehead, listening to him murmur names and fragments of memory in his fevered state, things she suspected he would never have spoken aloud while conscious. Once, he gripped her hand so tightly it nearly hurt, and murmured a name that was not her own, a name laced with such old, aching grief, that Margot felt her chest tighten with sympathy for a wound she still did not fully understand. By morning, the fever had broken, and the Duke slept peacefully for the first time in hours. Margot remained at his side until the physician arrived, confirming the danger had passed, and only then did she allow herself to be led away to rest, exhaustion finally overtaking her. When the Duke woke fully that afternoon and learned who had tended him through the night, refusing to leave his side despite his own instructions that he required no care, he said nothing to her directly. But that evening, a small bouquet of wildflowers appeared on her writing desk, gathered, she would later learn, from the garden's untended beds, cut by the Duke's own hand. There was no note. There did not need to be one. Something between them had shifted, quietly, irreversibly, in the space of a single fevered night. Margot did not yet know what to call it, but she understood, lying awake that evening with the scent of wildflowers filling her chambers, that the man she had married out of desperate necessity was no longer quite the stranger he had been on their wedding day. The frost was cracking, and beneath it she was beginning to glimpse the shape of something that had not yet learned how to be warm again, but was, perhaps, remembering how to try. The carriage arrived at Rothmere Hall on a gray afternoon in late autumn, its polished wheels churning the gravel drive, and Margot watched from the drawing-room window as a woman stepped down, dressed in mourning black that somehow managed to look fashionable rather than grieving, her dark hair arranged in perfect curls beneath a small, elegant hat. "Who is that?" Margot asked, though something in her chest had already gone tight with unease. Mrs. Pemble, standing beside her, had gone very still. "That, Your Grace, is Lady Delphine Carver. She was a great friend of His Grace's family, in years past." "A friend," Margot repeated, watching the woman glide up the front steps with the confidence of someone who had walked this path many times before. There is more to it than that, Your Grace, though it is not my place to say. Margot did not need Mrs. Pemble to say more. Something in the housekeeper's careful tone, the way her hands twisted slightly at her apron, told Margot everything she needed to know. Whoever Lady Delphine Carver was, her arrival was not welcome, and it was not without history. She met the woman properly an hour later, in the drawing room, where Lady Delphine had installed herself with the easy familiarity of someone who considered the house half her own. She was beautiful in a sharp, deliberate way, every gesture calculated for effect, and when she looked at Margot, her eyes performed a swift, assessing sweep, the kind that measured a rival and found her wanting. "So you are the new Duchess," Delphine said, her smile pleasant and entirely without warmth. "How very interesting. Gregory did not mention in his letters that he had married." "Gregory," Margot repeated carefully, noting the familiarity with which the woman used the Duke's given name. "We have known each other since childhood," Delphine said smoothly. "Our families were close, once. I confess I am surprised to find him married. He always swore he never would, after everything that happened." "After what happened?" Margot asked, though she suspected she would not receive an honest answer. Delphine's smile sharpened. "Perhaps you should ask your husband that, Your Grace, though I imagine there is a great deal about him you have yet to learn." The Duke arrived moments later, and Margot watched his expression carefully as he entered the room and saw who waited there. Something flickered across his face, too complicated to name, gone before she could fully read it, replaced immediately by the cool composure she had come to recognize as his defense against the world. "Delphine," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I was not expecting you. I heard the news of your marriage from a mutual acquaintance and simply had to see for myself." She rose gracefully, closing the distance between them with a familiarity that made Margot's stomach tighten. "You might have written to tell me, Gregory. After everything we once meant to each other, I would have thought I deserved that much." "There was nothing to write," the Duke said, though his jaw had tightened. "Our understanding ended long ago, Delphine. By your own choice, as I recall." "Circumstances were complicated," Delphine said, her voice softening into something almost wounded. "You know that better than anyone. I never stopped caring for you, Gregory, whatever choices I was forced to make at the time." Margot stood silently through the exchange, feeling increasingly invisible, an unwelcome witness to a history she did not fully understand, but could feel the weight of pressing against the room like a held breath. "I am sure the Duchess would like to know what you mean by that," the Duke said finally, his eyes cutting briefly to Margot, an unspoken apology in them. "Oh, I am sure she has already guessed," Delphine said lightly, though her gaze, when it landed on Margot, held something colder than her words suggested. "Gregory and I were engaged once, Your Grace, many years ago, before circumstances intervened. I married elsewhere, for reasons that seemed necessary at the time, and my husband passed away this past spring. I find myself rather unexpectedly, a widow with time on my hands and old friendships to renew." The words were delivered lightly, but Margot heard the challenge beneath them clearly enough. This was not a woman visiting out of simple friendship. This was a woman who believed she still had a claim on the man Margot had married, and who intended to remind him of it at every opportunity. "How unfortunate for your loss," Margot said carefully, "and how fortunate for you that Rothmere Hall welcomes old friends so warmly." Something flickered in Delphine's eyes, a brief recalculation, as though she had not expected the new Duchess to hold her ground so evenly. "How generous of you, Your Grace. I do hope we shall become great friends ourselves, in time." Margot did not believe that for a moment, but she smiled politely and said nothing further, watching as Delphine turned back to the Duke with a warmth that felt performed for Margot's benefit as much as anything else. That evening, the Duke found Margot in the garden, where she had retreated after dinner, needing air and distance from the tension that had settled over the house since Delphine's arrival. "I owe you an explanation," he said, standing several paces away, his hands clasped behind him in that familiar guarded posture. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. We did not marry for confidences." "Perhaps not, but I would rather you hear the truth from me than from Delphine's version of it." He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with visible care. "She and I were engaged 5 years ago, before my father died and I inherited the title. When the engagement was announced, everyone believed it a certainty. Then my father's health began to fail, and it became clear the estate had fallen into significant debt, debts he had kept hidden from all of us. When Delphine's family learned of it, they withdrew her from the engagement within the month. She married a wealthier man 3 months later." "I am sorry," Margot said, and found she meant it, though the sympathy came tangled with anger on his behalf. "I do not tell you this for sympathy," the Duke said. I tell you because I want you to understand something about the coldness you have found in this house. It was not always here. I loved her, or believed I did, enough that when she left, I decided love itself was a debt I could no longer afford to owe. I closed myself off from it entirely. I told myself it was strength. I have only recently begun to wonder if it was simply fear, wearing strength as a disguise. Margot studied him in the fading evening light, this man who had just handed her a piece of himself more honest than anything he had offered since their wedding day. Why tell me this now? Because Delphine will try to make you believe there is still something between us, he said quietly. And I find, to my own surprise, that I do not wish you to believe it. There is nothing between us beyond old history and older wounds. Whatever I once felt for her did not survive her leaving. I would not have it survive in your mind either. Something warm and cautious unfurled in Margot's chest at his words, though she was careful not to let it show too plainly. Thank you for telling me. Do not thank me yet, he said, something almost like a wry smile touching his mouth for the first time since she had known him. Delphine does not give up easily. I suspect she intends to make her visit a long one. He was right. Over the following days, Delphine settled into Rothmere Hall as though she had every right to remain indefinitely, engineering constant opportunities to draw the Duke into private conversation, reminiscing loudly about shared memories from their youth, always careful to frame Margot as an outsider to histories she could not possibly understand. Margot bore it with as much grace as she could manage, though the strain began to wear at her composure. She noticed too how the Duke seemed to grow more distant with each passing day, retreating further into his study, his expression tightening whenever Delphine's name was mentioned, until Margot began to wonder, despite his earlier assurances, whether old feelings truly could survive being buried, if only the right hand dug deep enough to unearth them. It was nearly a week into Delphine's visit that Margot found the letter. She had gone to the study to return a book, expecting the room empty, and found instead a folded paper lying open on the Duke's desk. Delphine's elegant handwriting immediately recognizable. Margot knew she should not read it. She read it anyway, some instinct warning her that this was important, and what she found there made her blood run cold. Gregory, the letter read, I know you feel it still, whatever you tell yourself and whatever vows you have made to that girl. Meet me tonight in the East Garden, after the household retires. We must speak plainly, one final time, about what we both know remains unfinished between us. Margot set the letter down with trembling hands, her mind racing through every possible interpretation and landing, again and again, on the worst one. Had she been foolish to believe his honesty in the garden days before? Had his confession been nothing more than a careful performance, designed to lower her guard while old feelings simmered beneath the surface, waiting for privacy to reignite them? She did not confront him. She told herself she would wait, watch, see whether he honored the meeting the letter demanded, and that evening, unable to bear the uncertainty, she found herself standing at her window past midnight, watching the East Garden below, where a single figure indeed moved through the darkness toward the garden gate. Her heart broke a little, watching him go. She did not know, standing there in the shadowed window, that what she was witnessing was not what it appeared to be at all, that the man walking toward that garden gate carried anger in his stride rather than longing, and that the conversation waiting for him there would change everything that came after it, in ways neither he nor Margot yet understood. All she knew, in that moment, was that the fragile trust built across weeks of small kindnesses suddenly felt as fragile as glass, and that she had never in her life felt so completely and helplessly alone. Margot did not sleep that night. She sat by the window long after the garden had emptied again, watching for the Duke's return, and when he finally reappeared, walking back toward the house with his shoulders set in a rigid, furious line, she told herself it meant nothing, and knew even as she thought it that she did not believe her own reassurance. She avoided him the following morning, taking her breakfast early and retreating to the small sitting room she had claimed as her own, needing time to steady herself before she could face him without her hurt showing plainly on her face. But he found her there before noon, knocking once before entering, his expression unusually tense. You look as though you have not slept, he said. Neither, I imagine, have you, Margot replied, keeping her voice carefully even. Your meeting last night must have run long. His eyes narrowed slightly. You knew about that. I saw the letter, Your Grace. I did not mean to. It was left open on your desk and I read more of it than I should have before I realized what it was. Something like understanding crossed his face, followed quickly by frustration, though whether it was directed at her or at the situation itself, Margot could not tell. Then you believe I went to that garden to renew some old affection with Delphine? I do not know what to believe, Margot admitted. You told me days ago that whatever you once felt for her did not survive her leaving, and then a letter arrives asking you to meet her in secret, and you go, without a word to me, and I am left in my window wondering which version of you was telling the truth. I went to that garden, the Duke said, his voice tightening with barely controlled anger, to tell Delphine, in terms she could not misunderstand, that whatever she believes still exists between us is a fiction of her own making. I went to tell her that my marriage is not a convenient obstacle for her to maneuver around, and that if she cannot conduct herself as a guest ought to in another man's house, she is no longer welcome in mine. Margot's breath caught. Then why did you not simply tell me that this morning, instead of allowing me to wonder? Because I did not realize you had cause to wonder, he said, and for the first time, real frustration broke through his composure. I told you the truth in the garden days ago, Margot. I did not think it required repeating. The use of her given name, rather than the formal address he had used since their wedding, struck her with unexpected force, though she pushed the feeling aside, still raw from the sleepless night behind her. Perhaps it does not, to a man accustomed to certainty. But I have spent this marriage learning your history in fragments, your grace, pieced together from portraits turned to the wall and gardens left to ruin and letters I was never meant to see. Forgive me if I do not yet trust every reassurance as fully as you might wish. The Duke was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, some of the anger had drained from his voice, replaced by something more tired, more honest. You are right to be cautious. I have given you little reason, in the whole of our short marriage, to believe I am capable of the kind of honesty a wife deserves. I have spent so many years guarding myself against being hurt again that I have forgotten how to make myself understood to someone I do not wish to hurt in turn. Then perhaps, Margot said softly, you might begin by telling me plainly what happened last night, without waiting for me to piece it together on my own. He nodded slowly, and for the next several minutes, he recounted the confrontation in full. Delphine's attempt to rekindle old affection, her insistence that his marriage was a temporary arrangement, born of necessity rather than genuine feeling, and his own firm, unwavering refusal to entertain any such suggestion. He told Margot of ordering Delphine, in no uncertain terms, to make arrangements to leave Rothmere Hall by week's end, and of the cold fury with which she had received the command. She will not leave quietly, he warned. Delphine has never accepted defeat gracefully. I suspect she will attempt something before her departure, some final effort to disrupt what peace we have managed to build here. Margot felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders, though a wary unease remained. Thank you for telling me. I should have told you last night, he said, rather than allowing you to sit alone with your doubts until morning. I am not accustomed, Margot, to considering how my silences might be received by someone who has come to care what I do. He paused, as though the admission had cost him something. But I find that I do wish to consider it, where you are concerned. The words hung in the air between them, quiet and unpolished, but unmistakably sincere, and Margot felt something in her chest loosen, the tight knot of the previous night's fear beginning, slowly, to unwind. Delphine did not leave quietly, exactly as the Duke had predicted, but the storm she raised came sooner and more sharply than either of them anticipated. 2 days after their conversation, Margot returned from a walk in the grounds to find the household in a state of hushed agitation, servants exchanging worried glances, Mrs. Pemble waiting anxiously near the entrance hall. What has happened? Margot asked. Lady Delphine has gone to His Grace with an accusation, Your Grace, Mrs. Pemble said carefully. I do not know the particulars, but voices were raised in the study not a quarter-hour ago. Margot found the Duke alone in his study moments later, standing rigid by the window, his expression carved from stone. What has she done? Margot asked. She is gone, he said flatly. She left an hour ago in considerable temper, after informing me that she intended to spread word through every household of consequence in the county that our marriage is a sham, arranged purely to settle my father's debts, and that I keep a wife I neither love nor respect while my true affections remain elsewhere. Margot's stomach dropped. Will people believe her? Some will. Delphine has always had a talent for making lies sound like confidences shared reluctantly. He turned to face her, and something in his expression, some raw and unguarded vulnerability, caught her entirely off guard. I told her the truth would prove her wrong soon enough. I told her that whatever this marriage began as, it has become something else entirely, something she cannot touch or diminish with her accusations. Did you mean that? Margot asked quietly. I have never meant anything more in my life, he said, and crossed the room to stand before her, closer than he had ever stood before. Close enough that she could see the honesty plain in his slate-gray eyes. I do not know precisely when it happened, Margot. Perhaps the night of my fever, when you sat beside me through hours you had no obligation to give. Perhaps in the garden, when I found myself telling you truths I had guarded for years. But I know that whatever this marriage was on our wedding day, it is not that any longer. And I find I do not want Delphine's lies, or anyone else's, to convince you otherwise. Margot's breath had gone unsteady, her heart beating hard against her ribs. I do not know what to say to that, Your Grace. Say nothing then, he said, something almost gentle in his voice now. Only believe it, that is all I ask. She did believe it, standing there in the quiet study with the autumn light slanting through the windows, though the fear Delphine's threats had planted did not entirely disappear. Reputation, once questioned, was a fragile thing, and Margot understood, better than most, how quickly whispers could become certainties in the mouths of people eager to believe the worst. She did not have long to wait before those whispers found their target. Within days, invitations that might otherwise have arrived began to thin, and at the one social gathering they did attend, a dinner hosted by a neighboring family, Margot felt the weight of curious, calculating stares following her through every room, felt conversations pause and resume in different tones whenever she drew near. Delphine's poison, it seemed, had already begun its slow work through the county's drawing rooms. It was on the carriage ride home from that dinner, in the close darkness of the cabin, that Margot finally allowed some of her carefully held composure to crack. They looked at me tonight as though I were a fraud, she said quietly. As though everyone in that room knew some secret I did not, some truth about my own marriage that I was too foolish to see. They know nothing, the Duke said firmly, reaching across the carriage to take her hand, a gesture so unexpected and so gentle that Margot's breath caught in her throat. They know only what Delphine has whispered in their ears, and whispers, however loud, are not truth. Give them time, Margot. Truth has a way of outlasting lies, however slow it may seem in the moment. And if it does not? She asked, her voice smaller than she wished it to be. If the whispers become the only truth anyone remembers, then we will simply have to prove them wrong together, he said, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles, for as long as it takes. Margot looked down at their joined hands in the darkness of the carriage, this small, quiet contact more intimate than anything they had shared before, and felt, despite the uncertainty pressing in from every side, a fragile thread of hope beginning to weave itself through the fear. Whatever storm Delphine had set in motion, it seemed, would have to be weathered together, and for the first time since her wedding day, Margot found she did not entirely mind the prospect of facing it beside the man whose hand now held hers so carefully in the dark. The road ahead remained uncertain, but something had shifted between them in that carriage, something neither of them named aloud, and both of them carried home in the quiet hours that followed, turning it over like a small, precious thing neither wished yet to examine too closely, for fear it might prove too fragile to survive the daylight. The letter from Alice arrived on a wet morning in early winter, and Margot knew from the very first line that something was terribly wrong. Papa has taken ill, her sister had written, her usually neat handwriting shaky and uneven across the page. The physician says it is a fever of the lungs, and he does not know if Papa's strength will be enough to see him through it. I did not wish to trouble you, but I do not know what else to do. I am frightened, Margot. Please, if you can come, please come. Margot's hands trembled as she read the letter a second time, then a third, as though repetition might change its contents. Her father, whose foolishness had brought them all to Rothmere Hall in the first place, whose debts had bound her to a stranger in a cold chapel months ago, was now fighting for his life, and her sister was alone to face it. She found the Duke in his study within minutes, the letter clutched in her hand, and did not wait for permission to speak. My father is gravely ill, she said, her voice breaking despite her best efforts to hold it steady. Alice writes that the physician holds little hope. I must go to them, Your Grace. I know it is a great deal to ask, but I must go. The Duke rose immediately from his desk, crossing the room to her side with none of the careful distance that had once defined every movement between them. You will not go alone, he said. I will have the carriage prepared within the hour, and I will accompany you myself. You do not have to. I am your husband, he said simply. And something in the quiet certainty of the words steadied her more than she expected. Your family's troubles are mine to share now, Margot. In sickness as much as in debt. We will go together. They traveled through the night, the carriage rattling over rutted roads slick with autumn rain, and Margot sat pressed close against the Duke's side, grateful beyond words for the solid warmth of his presence, for the steady way he held her hand throughout the journey, without once letting go. They arrived at her childhood home just past dawn, to find the house in quiet crisis. The physician's carriage already in the drive, Alice pale and exhausted in the front hall, having clearly not slept in days. "He is no better," Alice said, falling into Margot's arms the moment she crossed the threshold. "The physician says the next 2 days will tell whether he survives or not." Margot spent those 2 days at her father's bedside, barely leaving except to rest for a few desperate hours, when her body simply refused to continue without sleep. The Duke remained throughout, arranging for a second physician to be brought from the city at considerable expense, sitting with Alice in the parlor to keep her company through the worst of the waiting. And, on the second night, when Margot finally broke down entirely, overwhelmed by exhaustion and fear, he was the one who held her while she wept, saying nothing, offering only the steady, unwavering comfort of his presence. "I cannot lose him," Margot whispered into his shoulder, her composure finally shattered after days of forced strength. "Whatever his failings, he is my father. I cannot lose him, not like this, not so soon after everything else. You will not face it alone, whatever happens," the Duke said quietly, his arms tightening around her. "I promise you that, Margot, whatever comes, I am here." It was in the depths of that second night, sitting together in the quiet parlor while her father's fate hung uncertain in the room above, that Margot began to understand fully the depth of what had grown between them. This was not the cold, distant Duke who had married her out of obligation months before. This was a man who had traveled through the night without hesitation, who had spent his own fortune to bring aid to a family not truly his own, who now held her through her grief with a tenderness she would never have believed him capable of on the day she first met him in that stone chapel. Her father's fever broke on the third morning, and by the time the sun had fully risen, the physician pronounced him weak but out of immediate danger, likely to recover fully with rest and careful care. Margot wept again at the news, this time with relief rather than fear, and when she turned to the Duke to share the news, she found him already watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something unguarded and entirely without the frost that had once defined him so completely. "He will recover," she said. "Thank you. For all of it. I do not know how to properly thank you for everything you have done these past days." "You do not need to thank me," the Duke said softly, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her tired face with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "I did not come here out of obligation, Margot. I came because your family's suffering became my own, the moment I understood how much you meant to me. I do not know precisely when that happened, but I know it is true." Before Margot could find words to answer him, a commotion arose from the front hall, raised voices and the sound of hurried footsteps, and moments later Alice appeared in the parlor doorway, her face pale with a different kind of alarm entirely. "Margot," she said breathlessly, "there is a woman here, demanding to speak with you both. She says her name is Lady Delphine Carver, and she says she has proof of something urgent concerning His Grace." The Duke's expression darkened immediately, his earlier tenderness replaced by cold, controlled anger. "Send her away. She has no business here." But Delphine had already pushed past the servant attempting to bar her entry, sweeping into the parlor, with the same performed confidence she had brought to Rothmere Hall weeks before, though something in her manner now carried a desperate edge that had not been present before. "Forgive the intrusion," she said, though her tone suggested no genuine apology, "but I felt it only right to bring certain matters to light before this charade continues any further. Gregory, I know you have convinced yourself of some newfound affection for your convenient bride, but I have learned something you will wish to hear before you commit yourself further." "There is nothing you could say that would interest me, Delphine," the Duke said coldly. "You are not welcome here. Leave, before I have you removed." "Even if I told you," Delphine said, her voice sharpening, "that her father's debts were never as simple as they appeared, that the man you married her to save was, in fact, engaged in dealings that touch far closer to your own family's ruin than either of you realize." The room went very still. Margot felt her blood run cold, uncertain what accusation was about to unfold, watching her father's pale, weakened form through the doorway to the room where he still lay recovering, and dreading whatever truth Delphine had come to unveil. "Explain yourself," the Duke said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and choose your words with great care." Delphine's smile turned brittle, triumphant despite the tension crackling through the room. "The debts your father-in-law accumulated, Gregory, were not simple gambling losses as you were led to believe. They were incurred, in part, through dealings with the very man who orchestrated your own father's ruin years ago, the man whose betrayal cost your family half its fortune and drove your father to an early grave. Charles Sedgwick was not merely a foolish gambler, Your Grace. He was a business partner to your family's oldest enemy, whether he understood the connection or not." Margot's world tilted sharply. She looked to the Duke, searching his face for some sign of how to respond, and found there an expression of such stunned, complicated grief that her heart broke a little at the sight of it. "Is this true?" the Duke asked, turning to Margot, though his voice carried no accusation, only desperate need to understand. "I do not know," Margot said honestly, her voice shaking. "I know nothing of my father's business dealings beyond the debts themselves. If there is truth in what she says, it is truth my father never shared with me." It was her father's voice, weak but clear, that answered from the doorway, where he had risen despite his illness to stand unsteadily, supported by Alice, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand what was being alleged. "There is truth in it," Charles Sedgwick said, his voice raw with exhaustion and shame, though not the truth Lady Delphine implies. "I did business with a man named Ferris years ago, not knowing the full history between his family and the Rothmere line. When I understood the connection, it was already too late. My debts to him grew faster than I could manage, and by the time I recognized the danger, I was too deep in ruin to extract myself or my daughters from the consequences. I did not orchestrate anything, Your Grace. I was a fool who trusted the wrong man, and my foolishness nearly cost my daughter everything." The room fell into heavy silence, and Margot watched, breath held, as the Duke absorbed this new understanding, watched the complicated play of emotion across his face. Anger at old wounds reopened, grief for a father's ruin never fully explained, and beneath it all, something steadier, something that settled as he looked, finally, back to Margot. "None of this changes what stands between us," he said quietly, crossing the room to take her hand once more. "You did not choose your father's business partners, Margot, any more than I chose the enemy who ruined mine. Whatever old history connects our families, it does not touch what we have built together." He turned to Delphine, his expression hardening once more. "You have done what you came to do, Delphine. You have caused pain and revealed old wounds, but you have not succeeded in what you truly intended. Leave this house, and do not return to either of mine again." Delphine's composure finally cracked, her carefully maintained performance collapsing into something bitter and small. "You would choose her, after everything I have told you? After everything we once were to each other?" "I already chose her," the Duke said simply, "the moment I understood what she meant to me. Everything else, Delphine, is simply history you refuse to release." Delphine left without another word, her footsteps sharp and furious against the floorboards, and the front door closed behind her, with a finality that seemed to close too, on whatever remained of the past she had tried so desperately to resurrect. Margot's father, exhausted by the confrontation, was helped back to his bed by Alice, and Margot found herself alone with the Duke once more, in the quiet parlor, the weight of everything revealed that morning settling slowly around them. "I am sorry," she whispered. "For whatever my father's actions cost your family, however unknowingly. Do not apologize for sins that are not yours to carry," the Duke said, drawing her gently into his arms. "I have spent years blaming ghosts for wounds that time alone could not heal. I do not intend to let old grief poison what has grown between us now." He pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, the first true tenderness he had ever shown her. "You are not your father's debts, Margot, any more than I am my father's ruin. We are simply two people who found something unexpected in each other, despite everything that might have kept us apart." Margot rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt, for the first time since that terrible knock on her father's door months before, something like true peace settling over her. Whatever storms had brought them together, whatever old wounds had shadowed their path, she understood now, with complete certainty, that what stood between them was no longer obligation or debt. It was something far more precious than either of them had ever expected to find. They returned to Rothmere Hall a week later, once Charles Sedgwick had regained enough strength to be left safely in Alice's care, and the estate that greeted them felt different somehow, though nothing about the stone walls or the wide corridors had physically changed. It was Margot who had changed, she realized, walking through the entrance hall with a lightness in her step that had not been there when she first arrived as a frightened stranger months before. This house had become, somewhere in the difficult weeks between, something she was beginning to think of as home. The Duke seemed to feel it too. In the days following their return, Margot noticed small changes in him that she might once have thought impossible. He sought her company more often, not from obligation but from evident preference, finding reasons to walk with her through the grounds, to sit with her in the evenings rather than retreating alone to his study. He asked her opinion on matters of the household, deferred to her judgment on questions she would once have expected him to dismiss entirely, and slowly, carefully, began sharing pieces of himself he had kept locked away for years. It was on a quiet evening, nearly 2 weeks after their return, that he asked her to walk with him to the old drawing room, the one that had remained locked since her very first day at Rothmere Hall. "I have decided," he said, standing before the door with a key in his hand that Margot had never seen him carry before, "that it is time to open this room again. I would like you to be with me when I do." Margot said nothing, only nodded, understanding the significance of what he was offering her, and together they stepped into the room that had sat frozen in grief for years. Dust sheets covered every surface, and the air held the particular stillness of a place too long undisturbed. The Duke crossed slowly to the stacked portraits against the far wall, and with careful, deliberate hands, turned the first of them to face the room once more. It was a woman's portrait, warm-eyed and smiling, her dark hair much like the Duke's own, her expression full of a gentle kindness that seemed to reach across the years since it had been painted. "My mother," the Duke said quietly. "She died when I was 22. I could not bear to look at her image afterward, not alongside everything else that followed, so I had the room closed, and told myself I would return to it when I was ready. I never was, until now." Margot studied the portrait, seeing in the painted woman's face the same quiet strength Mrs. Pemble and the old gardener had described in their fragmented stories over the months. "She was beautiful," Margot said softly. "I understand now why the porcelain mattered so much to you." "She would have liked you," the Duke said, turning to look at Margot with an expression of such open affection that it stole the breath from her lungs. "She believed, as I once did, that a house should be full of warmth and laughter. I forgot that belief for a long time. You have reminded me of it, Margot, more thoroughly than I ever expected to be reminded of anything again." They spent the rest of the evening together in that room, uncovering furniture, opening curtains long closed against the light, and slowly, piece by piece, restoring warmth to a space that had sat cold and grieving for far too long. It felt, Margot thought, like a fitting reflection of everything that had happened between them since her wedding day, a slow, careful thawing of what had once seemed permanently frozen. It was that night, long after the household had retired, and the fires had burned low throughout the great stone hall, that Margot found herself unable to sleep, her mind full of everything the day had uncovered. She rose from her bed and made her way through the quiet corridors toward the Duke's study, drawn by the faint light still visible beneath his door. She found him standing by the window, much as she had found him on her very first night in this house, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. He turned as she entered, and something in his expression, open and unguarded in a way she had never seen before, made her heart quicken. "I could not sleep," she admitted. "Too much has happened today for my mind to settle." "Nor could I," he said, crossing the room toward her. "I have been thinking, Margot, about everything that has changed since you came into this house. I married you, believing I had nothing left to offer a wife beyond safety and comfort. I told you, on our very first day together, that affection was a thing I had given away long ago and could not recover." He paused, close enough now that she could see the honesty plain in his eyes. "I was wrong. I do not know precisely when the lie became untrue, whether it was the night of my fever, or the morning in the garden, or the long hours we spent together at your father's bedside. But I know, standing here with you now, that I was entirely wrong." "Your Grace, Gregory," he said softly. "I would like you to call me Gregory, Margot, if you are willing. I find I do not wish to be your Grace to you any longer, not when what I feel for you has become so far removed from anything a title could contain." "Gregory," Margot repeated, testing the name, feeling something warm bloom in her chest at the sound of it, at the intimacy it implied. "I have called many things treasures in my life," he said, reaching up to gently cup her face in his hands. "Land, title, the fortune I was so desperate to protect after my father's ruin. I understand now how foolish that was. None of it ever brought me a single moment of the peace I have found simply sitting beside you in a quiet room, or holding your hand through a difficult night, or watching you defend a frightened kitchen maid with more courage than I have shown in years." His thumb traced softly along her cheek. "You are not the debt I settled, Margot. You have become, without my ever intending it, the greatest treasure I have ever known. I do not say this lightly, and I do not say it because duty or convention requires it. I say it because it is, simply and completely, true." Margot felt tears gather in her eyes, though they were tears of a happiness so complete she had never imagined herself capable of feeling it, not on that terrible night when her father first told her of the debt, not on her cold wedding day, not in any of the uncertain weeks that had followed. "I did not expect to love you," she whispered. "I came to this house believing I was saving my family through duty alone, expecting nothing more than safety in return. I did not think a man who greeted me with such coldness could ever become someone I would choose, again and again, even if given every chance to walk away. And do you? He asked, his voice suddenly uncertain, vulnerable in a way she had never heard from him before. Choose this, Margot? Choose me, not as the debt that bound you, but as the man standing before you now? I do, Margot said, with a certainty that surprised even herself. I choose you, Gregory, not out of obligation, and not out of duty. I choose you because somewhere in these difficult months, you became the home I did not know I was searching for. He kissed her then, softly at first, then with a depth of feeling that spoke of months of carefully guarded longing finally allowed to surface, and Margot felt every last remnant of frost between them dissolve entirely into warmth. Outside the study window, the winter stars burned steady and bright over Rothmere Hall, over gardens that would bloom again with the coming spring, over a house that had finally remembered how to hold love within its walls. What had begun as a bargain struck in desperation, a marriage of debt and duty between a ruined family and a grieving stranger, had become, in the end, something neither of them could have predicted on that cold morning in the stone chapel. It had become a love neither had believed themselves capable of finding again, chosen freely, held tightly, and treasured beyond any price either of them could have named. Spring came early to Rothmere Hall the following year, and with it came a transformation the old gardener had not seen in nearly a decade. The wild beds that had once grown tangled and untended now bloomed in careful, deliberate color, roses climbing fresh over the stone archway, the borders trimmed with the same devoted care the old Duchess had once given them. Margot spent many mornings there herself, her hands in the soil alongside the gardener, learning the names of flowers she had never known before, filling the grounds with the same warmth she had brought to every corner of the house she now called home. The drawing room that had sat locked and grieving for years stood open now, its portraits restored to their proper places, its furniture uncovered and in daily use, a favorite gathering place for the household in the quiet hours after dinner. Gregory often found Margot there in the evenings, reading by the window where his mother's portrait watched over the room with her painted, gentle smile, and he would join her without a word, simply glad to share the space that had once held only sorrow. The whispers Delphine had once spread through the county's drawing rooms faded, as Gregory had promised they would, replaced instead by a different kind of talk entirely, of the Duke of Rothmere's evident devotion to his wife, of a household transformed from cold formality into genuine warmth, of a marriage that had begun as a matter of debt and become, in the eyes of everyone who witnessed it, a true and rare love. Even Mr. Doran, the stern steward who had once questioned Margot's authority, came in time to respect her judgment above his own, and Nell, the young maid whose position Margot had once defended, rose within the year to a position of trust within the household, forever grateful to the mistress who had shown her kindness on her very first difficult day. Charles Sedgwick recovered fully from his illness, and though the shadow of his past mistakes never fully left him, he found in his daughter's happiness a measure of redemption he had not believed himself capable of earning. He visited Rothmere Hall often, welcomed now not as a debtor whose failures had bound his daughter to a stranger, but as a beloved father whose presence brought genuine joy to the house. Alice, too, blossomed under her sister's care, eventually finding a match of her own, chosen freely and without the desperate necessity that had once shaped Margot's path. A match that brought her happiness Margot took quiet, fierce pride in having helped secure. As for Margot and Gregory, the frost that had once defined their beginning became, with each passing season, a memory so distant it seemed almost to belong to different people entirely. Where once the Duke had greeted his bride with cold formality in a silent stone chapel, he now greeted her each morning with a warmth that filled every room he entered, a devotion evident to anyone who witnessed even a moment between them. The house that had stood so long like a tomb around its grieving master had become, through nothing more than patience, kindness, and the slow, careful work of two wounded hearts learning to trust again, a true and lasting home. On the anniversary of their wedding, a year to the day since that cold, silent ceremony in the stone chapel, Gregory led Margot back to the same small church, though this time the pews were filled with family and friends, the altar decorated with flowers Margot had grown with her own hands, and the vows they exchanged, renewed freely and without the weight of obligation that had once shadowed them, were spoken in voices full of genuine, unhesitating love. "A year ago," Gregory said quietly, as they stood together afterward in the chapel doorway, watching the late afternoon light spill golden across the churchyard, "I told you I had nothing left to give a wife beyond safety and silence. I did not believe in that moment that I would ever again know what it meant to call something a treasure. And now," Margot asked, smiling up at him with a happiness that had once seemed entirely beyond her reach. Now, he said, drawing her close, I know precisely what a treasure is. I am looking at her. They walked home together, through the fading light, past gardens blooming with new life, toward a house that had finally, after so many years of silence and grief, learned once more how to hold warmth within its walls, and how, against every cold beginning, love could still find its way home.